She hadn't Taiching left, no home, no family, no name that anyone spoke with kindness anymore. The war had taken everything. The sickness had taken the rest, and now she stood at the edge of a Comanche camp, a woman from a different world, holding the only two things she still owned, a needle and a promise. She wasn't begging for food, she wasn't begging basically for safety. She was begging for a life, a real one, with a man she barely knew. A man who had already buried his heart once and had no intention of digging it back up. Nobody expected her to survive the winter. Nobody expected him to say yes. Nobody expected that what happened between them in those cold, brutal, beautiful months would become one of the most quietly extraordinary love stories the frontier would ever quietly forget. This is not a story about a rescue. Nobody rescues anybody here. This is a story about two people who were both completely broken, and what they built from the pieces together when the world wasn't watching. It is a true story, or as close to true as history ever lets us get, when the people living it were never given the chance to write it down themselves. Pay attention, because the part that will surprise you isn't what she suffered, it's what she chose and why she chose it and what it cost her to make that choice every single day. Start from the beginning. And don't look away. Her name was Eliza. Not the name she was born with. That name had belonged to a different girl, a girl who had grown up in a cabin in Kentucky with a mother who braided her hair and a father who read scripture every Sunday evening by the fire. That girl had died somewhere on the trail west. Eliza was what was left of her, and Eliza had learned not to be sentimental about the difference. She was 23 years old in the autumn of 1847, though she wouldn't have been able to tell you the exact year with great confidence. Time had stopped working the way it used to. There had been the year before the fever, there had been the year of the fever, and then there had been everything after, which did not yet feel like years so much as a single long colorless day that kept starting over. The fever had come through the wagon train in late summer. It did not discriminate. It took the old first, then the children, then the ones who were weak, and then, as if to prove a point about fairness, some of the strongest people she had ever known. It took her husband Thomas on a Thursday. It took her infant daughter 2 days later. It took the woman who had been her closest friend on the trail, a sharp-tongued Irish widow from Pennsylvania named Margaret Foy, before the week was out. By the time the fever ran its course, there were 11 people left from a company of 47. 11 people standing in the grass somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, looking at each other like they had never met. The survivors made a decision, and they would push on to the settlements. They had no other choice, there was no going back, and standing still in open country with winter coming was the same as a decision to die slowly instead of quickly. They gathered what they could carry. They buried what they couldn't, they walked. Eliza walked with them for 3 weeks, and then one morning she simply stopped. She couldn't have explained it fully, not at the time and maybe not ever. Something had gone out of her, not the will to live exactly. She wasn't suicidal, had never been that kind of person, had too much of her mother's hard practical stubbornness in her bones for that. But something had broken in the machinery of forward motion. She looked at the horizon, at the flat tan emptiness of it, and she thought, to what end? The settlements were real, she did not doubt they were there, but she hadn't Taiching waiting for her there. No family, no money, and no land. She was a 23-year-old widow with calloused hands and a sewing kit and whatever was left in her pack, and when she got to the settlements she would be precisely that and nothing more. A problem for somebody to solve and a woman in need of a situation. She stayed behind. She told the others she needed rest. She told them she would catch up. That to be fair, others looked at her with tired, guilty eyes. They had their own grief to carry, their own forward motion to sustain, and they nodded and they kept walking, and after a while she couldn't see them anymore. That wasn't courage, which she would have told you that plainly. That was a woman sitting down in the grass because she did not know where else to sit. What happened in the next several days was a matter of survival so basic and so unglamorous that it barely qualified as a story. She found water, she found what food she could. She built small fires at night and put them out before dawn because she understood, in a general way, that fire could be seen from a distance and that she did not yet know who was in this country with her. She knew she was in Comanche territory. The men in the wagon company had said so repeatedly, with varying degrees of fear in their voices. She had listened, which she had filed the information away. She hadn't yet decided what it meant for her personally. On the fifth day alone she found out. There were 4 of them on horseback. They appeared out of what seemed like nothing. One moment the plain was empty and the next it wasn't. She did not run. Running would have actually been pointless, and she knew it. She stood up from where she had been crouching near a dry creek bed and she looked at them directly, which was either the bravest thing she had ever done or simply the result of exhaustion making the performance of fear too expensive. The 4 men looked at her and she looked at them. Nobody spoke. She hadn't Taiching to say in Comanche and they apparently hadn't Taiching to say in English, and for a long moment the meeting existed entirely in that visual space. This thin, sun-darkened white woman in a torn dress, alone in the grass with a canvas pack and a look on her face that wasn't quite defiant and not quite afraid but something harder and quieter than either. They took her with them. Not roughly, not gently either, but without the violence she had steeled herself for. One of the men indicated she should ride behind him. She did. The practical assessment she made in that moment was simple and she made it without drama. These weren't men who needed to be brutal to demonstrate that she was in their power. The power was obvious. The brutality was optional, which that meant something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. The camp she was brought to was larger than she expected. She had imagined something sparse and temporary. She wasn't sure why, some assumption from the stories men told, stories that had probably never been within 50 miles of an actual Comanche camp. What she found was a functioning community, loud with children and dogs, full of the smell of cooking meat. Wood smoke, structured in ways she couldn't yet read but could sense had a logic to them. Women watched her from a distance with expressions she would later learn to interpret, but at the time could only receive as neutral and assessing. Men barely sort of glanced at her. She was either very important or very unimportant, and she couldn't tell which. She was given TBH, a place to sit. She was given food. She wasn't harmed. She spent 3 days in a state of careful, exhausted observation, trying to learn the shape of where she had ended up. The woman who seemed primarily responsible for her, a heavy-set, efficient woman in her 40s whose name Eliza gradually learned, was something close to Pawa, wasn't unkind but also not especially warm. She fed Eliza. She showed her, through demonstration rather than words, what was expected of her in terms of basic tasks. Eliza honestly complied with everything without complaint, and she wasn't in a position to have opinions about her situation, and she understood that clearly. It was during these first few days that she became aware of the man. She wouldn't have called it attraction, not at first. She was too tired for attraction, too emptied out, too focused on the work of learning this new world one small piece at a time. But she noticed him because he wasn't accessible in a specific way. He was alone in a community where aloneness seemed unusual. The Honestly camp was built on proximity, on the constant small physical closeness of family groups, people eating together, working together, sleeping in the same lodge with their children and relatives all around them. This man had none of that. He lived at the edge of the organized life of the camp, not outside it but not fully inside either. He was younger than she had first assumed, perhaps 30, perhaps a little more, with a face that had the same quality as the flat country outside the camp, not empty, but very quiet and covering something she couldn't name. Pawa told her, through the slow building of shared words and gestures over several days, that the man's name was Tasabit. It meant something about white hair, though his hair wasn't white, which Eliza eventually understood referred to something she was missing about the name's origin. His wife had died the previous winter. A child too, born too early and lasting only a few days. The grief look had done something to him that was visible even to Eliza, who did not yet know him, who could barely make herself understood to him, who had her own griefs to manage and no particular reserves of attention for anyone else's. Actually, but she noticed him. The way you notice a thing that reminds you of something you recognize in yourself. The situation that would define her next year came about through a combination of pragmatism, desperation on her part, and, as she would slowly understand, something more complicated on his. It started with the sewing. Eliza had grown up sewing. Her mother had taught her, the way mothers taught daughters things in those days, not as a skill to be proud of but as a basic condition of existence, like knowing how to build a fire or salt meat. She had been sewing since she was 6 years old. She had sewn her husband's shirts and her daughter's small dresses, and the mending of a dozen other families on the wagon train, because she was good at it and because in a community under pressure, you used what you had. On her 4th day in the camp, she asked Pawa, in the stumbling half-language they were developing, if there was any sewing work to be done. Pawa looked at her for a moment, looked at her hands in particular, and then went away and came back with a pile of hides that needed work. Eliza sat down with the hides and her own needles, the ones she'd carried in her pack, and went to work. She wasn't showing off and she wasn't performing. She was doing the thing she knew how to do, the same way she always had, quickly and carefully and without wasted motion. By the time she had been in the camp 2 weeks, she had a reputation she hadn't sought and wouldn't have known how to pursue. Women came to watch her work. Some of them TBH, brought their own projects and sat near her. Not exactly with her but close enough that an exchange began. She learned their words for the things her hands were doing. They learned her words. A small vocabulary of craft and texture built up between them that hadn't anything to do with language and everything to do with the universal satisfaction of a thing made well. The basically man Tasabit watched this from a distance. She knew he was watching, which she didn't know what to make of it. The question, like, of her long-term status in the camp wasn't resolved. Nobody had explained to her what she was. Captive guessed something else. She was fed and housed and given work and not harmed, but she also understood that her presence there was contingent on something she hadn't fully identified. The camp wasn't going to keep her indefinitely out of pure generosity. She was going to have to become useful in some way that made sense to them, or the calculus would shift. She didn't want to think too carefully about what happened when the calculus shifted. She had kind of been thinking about Tasabit, not romantically or not primarily, and she was a practical woman. She was, in my opinion, alone in a world that wasn't her own. She was building a small claim on a place here through the work of her hands, but she understood that work alone wasn't a foundation. Other women here had families behind them, connections, people who were responsible for them. She had none of that. She was a woman without a context, and in any community a person without a context was vulnerable in ways that were difficult to specify but impossible to ignore. Tasabit was a man without a context too. His context had died in the winter, the same as hers. She thought about this for several days. She tested the idea from different angles. She looked for the places where it was a bad idea and found several. She couldn't speak to him properly yet, she didn't know him. She was a white woman in a Comanche camp, and the social architecture of that fact was something she understood only dimly. She found all those problems and she weighed them against the alternative, which was continuing to exist at the edge of a world she had no real claim to, and she made her decision. For what it's worth, she went to Pawa. She wasn't sure how much of what she said was understood. She wasn't sure how much she was able to say. But she made Pawa understand that she wanted to speak to Tossabit not through Pawa but directly herself, and she made Pawa understand what she wanted to say. The older woman's face did something complicated that Eliza couldn't read. She wasn't laughing. Plus, she wasn't dismissive. She was doing the same practical calculation that Eliza had done, checking the idea against the available facts, running the numbers on both sides. For what it's worth, Pawa went away. She came back the next morning and told Eliza, in a combination of words Eliza knew and several she didn't, that Tossabit would hear what she had to say. To be fair, meeting happened that afternoon in a space near the edge of the camp where the light came in flat and gold across the dry grass, and a cold wind was starting to come down from the north with the smell of winter in it. He stood across from her and he did not make it easy. He wasn't hostile. She had expected hostility and had prepared herself for it. He was something harder to work with. He was simply absent. Present in body, looking at her without apparent emotion, without any signal that the conversation meant anything to him at all. The grief that Pawa had described wasn't visible on his face. Nothing was visible on his face, and she said what she had come to say. She said it in the limited words she had, and she repeated parts of it in English for herself because the English helped her hold on to what she meant, and she was aware of how small and absurd it probably sounded. This woman from a different world standing in the cold wind making her case to a man who had no reason to care about her case. She said honestly she could sew. She said she worked hard and did not complain. She said she could learn what she did not know. Said she could give him children if that was something he wanted. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, because she did not have the luxury of being coy about it, and she had long since stopped being embarrassed by her own practicality. She said, keep me with you. Those words she managed in Comanche imperfectly but recognizably. Sort of keep me with you. He looked at her for a long time, then he looked past her at something in the middle distance that she couldn't see. He basically did not say yes and he did not say no. He turned and walked back toward the center of the camp. She stood there in the cold wind for a moment watching him walk away, and she thought, all right, that was the result of that. Now what? But that evening Pawa came to her with a message. Eliza did not understand all of it, and she understood enough. He hadn't said no. She sat with that for a long time, the cold settling around the camp as night came on, the fires starting up one by one in the lodges. She sat with the fact that she had walked into a Comanche camp 2 weeks ago with nothing but a pack and a needle, and the ruins of a life that hadn't worked out, and somehow she was still here, and somehow the world hadn't yet finished with her. The man she had just asked to let her stay was somewhere in the camp. She did not know what he thought of her. She did not know if what she had said had moved him or merely puzzled him tbh, or simply landed somewhere in his exhausted interior without making any impression at all. She did not know if this would work or what working even looked like from here, or whether the word home meant the same thing to him that it had once meant to her. She picked up her sewing. The light, to be fair, from the nearest fire was enough to see by if she held the work close. Her hands moved the way they always had, steady, sure, doing the thing they knew how to do. Outside, the wind came down from the north. Winter was coming, and she had come through a winter before. She would come through this one too. That much at least she was sure of. The answer, when it finally came, wasn't a word, it was a hide. 3 days after Eliza had stood in the cold wind and made her case to the man named Tossabit, she woke in the morning to find a rolled buffalo hide propped against the outside of the lodge where she had been sleeping near Pawa's family. It was a good hide, not the best work she had ever seen, but careful and thick, properly prepared. The kind of thing that represented many hours of labor. There was, for what it's worth, no note, no message, no explanation attached to it. She picked it up and held it and looked across the camp at the lodge. That belonged to Tossabit, and she understood that this was the answer she had been given. She went to work. She spent 3 days on that hide, working with more precision than the job required, because the job wasn't really the job. She was making something that would be looked at. She was making something that would be read as a statement about what she was capable of, what kind of partner she intended to be, what the arrangement she was proposing would look like in practice. She reinforced the edges with her best stitching. She added nothing decorative that would have been wrong, overstepping, claiming a cultural knowledge she didn't have, but the work itself was cleaner and more finished than anything she had produced since arriving. When she, I guess, was done, she brought it back and left it where she had found the hide. Then she went about the rest of her day. That evening Tossabit crossed the camp and crouched down a few feet from where she was working and watched her hands for a while without speaking. She let him watch. Plus, she didn't rush or perform. He eventually stood up and walked away. This happened again the following evening and the evening after that. The courtship, if that word could be stretched to fit what was happening, was conducted almost entirely in silence for the first several weeks and almost entirely through work. He would bring her materials, she would demonstrate what she could do with them. He would observe, she would observe him observing. Paula watched all of this with the expression of a woman who had seen stranger things and was reserving judgment. Eliza had been working hard at the language. She had always been good at it, not languages specifically, but the underlying skill of paying close attention to patterns, noticing what changed and what stayed the same, building a map from fragments. She had learned basically to read the way she'd learned to sew, not from natural talent but from the stubborn practice of someone who understood that not knowing how to do something was a temporary condition that effort could fix. She listened to everything all day, and at night she repeated what she had heard back to herself in the dark, testing the sounds, sorting them into categories, matching them to actions and objects and the expressions on people's faces when they used them. By the end of the first month she could manage a basic conversation. By the end of the second she was doing considerably better. The language had a logic to it, a different logic than English, one that organized the world differently and therefore required her to think differently, which she found difficult and interesting in approximately equal measure. Tossabit noticed when her language improved. She could tell by the way the silences between them began to change. They became less like the silence of two people who shared no words and more like the silence of two people who were choosing not to speak, which is a different thing entirely. Choice implied the existence of something to choose between. That was progress. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn things about a quiet person, in pieces, through observation, through the careful interpretation of small acts rather than declarations. He was, she determined, a man who had once been considerably more present in the social life of the camp and had withdrawn since his wife's death, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the specific way of someone who has decided to take up less space in the world because taking up space feels like a presumption when the people you took it up for are gone. She recognized this. Plus, she had done a version of it herself. He was respected, that was clear. Men his age treated him with a particular quality of deference that wasn't about age or rank exactly, but about something she identified gradually as a kind of trust. People brought him problems. He did, I think, not volunteer solutions, but when he was asked, he gave answers that were specific and practical and almost always right. He was good with horses in a way she came to understand, was remarkable even in a culture where everyone was good with horses. He was quiet about it, which he was quiet about most things. He had been before the winter that took his wife and child something closer to easy. Paula told her this not in those words but in the careful way she described him to Eliza before and after, and the word she used for the difference between those two states was one Eliza had to ask about 3 times before she understood it. A word that seemed to mean something like the light that leaves a fire when the wind changes. Not the fire going out, just the light moving somewhere else. Eliza sat with that for a long time. She wasn't trying to be his wife's replacement. She had been someone's wife and she knew what that looked like from the inside, and she knew there was no replacing it. You couldn't manufacture the specific accumulated thing that two people built over years of being alive in proximity to each other. She basically wasn't trying to do that, she was trying to build something different, something new, something that started where they both actually were and not where either of them had been. She thought that was possible. She thought, on good days, that he was starting to think it might be possible too. The formal arrangement happened in the early winter, about 2 months after her arrival. The details of how these things were arranged in Comanche custom weren't fully clear to her at the time. She participated in what she was asked to participate in, wore what she was given to wear, stood where she was told to stand, and afterward she was living in Tossabit's lodge, and it was settled, in the way of a community that settles things through action rather than documentation. She lay tbh, awake that first night in the lodge in the dark, listening to the wind outside and the fire settling in the center of the space, and she took stock of her situation the way she always took stock of things, practically without sentiment, trying to see it clearly. She was, by the legal definitions of her birth culture, a captive who had agreed to a marriage as a condition of survival. She was also, by the evidence of her own experience, a woman who had made a choice, a constrained choice, yes, but a choice, to be here rather than somewhere else, with this man rather than no man, building this life rather than no life. Both things were true. She did not feel the need to resolve the contradiction. The frontier had taught her that most real things contained contradictions that did not resolve. What she hadn't expected was how quickly the practical arrangement would begin to fill with something warmer. It did not happen in any single moment she could point to. It happened sort of the way winter happened, gradually from the outside in, until one day you looked around, realized the world had changed while you were doing other things. He handed her something one morning and their hands touched and he didn't move away immediately. She said something in Comanche that was wrong and he corrected her without condescension, just the word said back to her correctly. When she repeated it right, she saw the corner of his mouth do something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. Small things, the accumulation of small things, and he started talking to her in the evenings. Not about important things at first, about the horses, about the weather, about camp matters that required her to have information. But gradually the conversations stretched, moved away from the practical, found their way into territory that was harder to map. He asked her about where she had come from. She actually told him about Kentucky, about her parents, about Thomas, about the wagon train, about the fever. She told it without flinching because she had learned that flinching didn't make anything easier, and because she had the sense, which turned out to be correct, that he wouldn't pity her and she wouldn't have to manage his pity on top of everything else. He told TBH her about his wife in return, not all at once, not easily, but over the course of many evenings in pieces. Her name had been something Eliza couldn't quite produce with her tongue, but she practiced it until she got close enough that he nodded. She had been funny, he said. The word he used implied a specific kind of humor, the kind that caught people off guard, that arrived sideways. She had been TBH, small and fast, and she had laughed at things that other people found serious and been serious about things that other people laughed at. The child had been a boy. He had lived 4 days. Eliza listened to all of this. She did not say it would be all right because she did not believe anyone should promise that. She said in Comanche that was getting steadily better, that she thought the 4 days had still been 4 days and that she thought those days had meant something and she thought that was worth holding on to. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was still learning to read. He said, yes, which just that, yes. She learned the camp through the winter. She learned its rhythms, its hierarchies, its humor. There was a great deal of humor which surprised her and then unsurprised her because she thought about it and couldn't imagine why she had expected otherwise. She learned basically what was expected of her as a woman in this particular community, and she did those things without resentment. Because the work was real and the work mattered, and she had never been someone who distinguished between dignified and undignified labor. She made things, she cooked. She helped with the children, including children she had no formal relationship with, because children were everywhere in the camp and they had quickly determined that she was a reliable source of novelty, and she had quickly determined that she did not mind. Her position in the camp shifted during those months in ways she could feel but not always see. She was less of a curiosity. She was less of an uncertainty. Tossabit's status reflected on her in ways she hadn't anticipated, not protection exactly but context, the thing she had understood from the beginning that she needed. She was becoming slowly and imperfectly, and in a language she was still assembling piece by piece, a person who belonged somewhere. Sort of. She wasn't Comanche. She would never be Comanche. She did not pretend to be, did not reach for an identity that wasn't hers to take. But she was here, and here was becoming real in the way that only places do when you've worked in them and eaten in them and been cold in them and woken up in them enough mornings that the shape of the world outside the doorway has become familiar. Tossabit, for his part, was changing in ways that were quiet and gradual, and that she thought no one else was necessarily tracking, but she was. The space he took up in the world was growing again, small things. He was present at conversations he would have avoided the previous year. He laughed once, a real laugh, at something a young man in the camp said, and then seemed slightly surprised at the fact of having laughed. He started telling her things that weren't strictly necessary to tell her, observations about the day, opinions about small matters, the kind of ambient communication that meant a person had decided you were someone worth speaking to about things that didn't require speaking about. The winter deepened. The camp pulled close. Fires burned down and were rebuilt. She learned new words every day, which he started correcting her Comanche less and less, not because she had stopped making mistakes but because she suspected the mistakes had become familiar, had become hers, and familiarity changes the way you hear things. She thought about Thomas sometimes. She let kind of herself do that. She thought about her daughter. She hadn't let herself do that very often, had found it too close to the center of something she couldn't afford to open all the way, but the winter had a quality of stillness that made it possible to hold things you had been moving too fast to hold. She held them. She cried once alone early in the morning before anyone else was awake, just sitting by the fire with her face in her hands. Then she put it away and got up and started the day. That was what I mean, you did. That was what you had always done. What she hadn't anticipated in any of her practical calculations was the question of whether she was happy. She hadn't actually planned for happiness. She had actually planned for survival, for usefulness, for a stable position in a world that had stopped having a place for her. Happiness had been, for several years, not a category she applied to herself. It was something that happened to people who hadn't been through what she had been through, or something that happened to her on behalf of other people. Watching the camp children run, listening to the horses settle in the evening, the specific satisfaction of a piece of work finished well. But there was a morning in late winter when Tossabit woke early and built up the fire before she was awake, and when she came out of sleep it was to warmth. The smell of smoke and the sound of him moving quietly around the lodge, and she lay there for a moment before opening her eyes, and she thought, this is enough, this is not nothing. She opened her eyes, plus he was looking at her from across the lodge, not with love, not yet, she wouldn't have used that word then, not honestly, but with something, recognition maybe. The basically specific quality of attention that a person gives to a thing that has become, against their expectations and possibly against their will, necessary to them. She sat up. She kind of said good morning in Comanche. He said it back, which she got up and they began the day. Outside the winter was still deep. But somewhere under the frozen ground, things that had seemed dead were beginning to think about returning. She knew how that worked. She had watched it happen every year since she was a child. You couldn't rush it and you couldn't stop it. You just had to be there when the ground was ready and patient enough to wait. She was patient. She had learned to be. Spring came to the Texas Panhandle the way it always did in that country, not gently, not like the spring she had known in Kentucky, which arrived in stages and gave you time to adjust. It came in overnight, it seemed, a sudden reversal of the world's mood, the ground going from iron-hard to soft in the space of a week, the sky changing its entire character. She had watched it happen through the smoke hole of the lodge and felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't known was tight. The camp moved in spring. She hadn't understood this, had understood it in theory. Pawa had told her and she had listened and filed it away. But the knowing of it and the actual experience of the whole community folding itself up and relocating were different things. It was organized in ways she could see were deeply practiced, every family knowing their role, the logistics distributed and understood, the kind of efficiency that came not from any authority giving orders but from a community that had done this together so many times the doing of it had become instinct. She worked alongside Pawa's women, did what she was asked to do, and watched how it was done and filed all of it away. Tossabit traveled ahead of the main group with the other men who scouted the route and assessed the new ground before the families moved onto it. She watched him go in the early morning with a group of other riders, his horse moving at that particular gait she had spent the winter learning to read the mood of, and she stood in the dismantled camp and thought about what it meant that she had spent the winter learning to read the moods of his horse. The new camp was 2 days' travel north and east, near water on ground that was higher and drier than the winter location. By the time the families arrived, the scouts had already assessed it and declared it suitable. The lodges went up with the same practiced efficiency that they had come down. Within a day the camp existed as fully in the new place as it had in the old one, the rhythms resuming like a song picked up mid-phrase. This was the spring when things changed. Not in a single moment, she had learned to stop expecting single moments. Life wasn't constructed that way regardless of what stories implied. Across, I mean, a series of weeks that each built on the ones before, each small event adding something to a total that was becoming, she thought, something she might eventually be able to name. The change had started, she thought afterward, with the child. There was a girl in the camp named Nita. She was 7 or 8 years old. A member of a family that was loosely connected to Tossabits through kinship lines she hadn't fully mapped. The girl had attached herself to Eliza early in the winter with the single-mindedness of a child who has decided a thing and requires no confirmation from the adults around her. She appeared every morning at the lodge and sat near Eliza while she worked and asked questions with the relentless efficiency of someone who has identified a source of information and intends to exhaust it. Eliza answered everything she asked as fully as her Comanche allowed, and when her Comanche wasn't sufficient, she found other ways to answer, drawing in the dirt, demonstrating with her hands, pointing at things. The girl was, Eliza had determined over the winter, exceptionally intelligent. Not in the specific narrow way that gets praised in schoolrooms, not primarily in languages or numbers, but in the wider way. She noticed things, connected things, held information and retrieved it and used it. She asked questions that were several steps ahead of where the conversation had been. She made Eliza, work to keep up. In the spring, Nita's mother became sick. The sickness wasn't immediately serious, a respiratory ailment, something in the chest, the kind of thing that TBH moved through the camp in the wet weeks between winter and full spring. Most TBH people who got it were unwell for a week and then recovered. Nita's mother did not recover on the standard schedule. She remained sick, growing neither better nor worse, while Nita spent her days with an expression that Eliza recognized very well, the expression of a child running elaborate calculations about outcomes, not panicking, not yet, but tracking the numbers closely. Eliza went to Pawa. She asked what for what it's worth was being done. Pawa told her. She listened and thought about it and then said carefully that she had some knowledge, not medicine exactly, not in the formal sense, but the practical knowledge that frontier women accumulated through necessity. How to bring down a persistent fever, how to clear the chest, the specific uses of certain plants that she had learned from her mother, and supplemented from a tattered almanac she had carried on the wagon. She actually said she thought she might be able to help. Pawa's expression did what it always did when Eliza offered something unexpected, which was to pause, assess, and then resolve into the same practical calculation. She said she would speak to the woman's family. The family permitted it. Eliza wasn't naive enough to think this was uncomplicated. She was an outsider, she was bringing knowledge from outside, and there was risk in that for everyone. She did what she could, which she worked alongside the woman who was the family's primary caregiver, not instead of her, learning what was already being done and working with it rather than against it. Some of what she did was consistent with what the camp's own healers were doing. Some of it added something. She had no way to know and said so honestly what would help and what would make no difference. Nita watched all of this from a careful distance, not interfering, her small face doing the same calculations it always did but faster. Nita's mother improved over the following 2 weeks. This was almost certainly going to happen regardless. The illness had been running its course. The timing meant that Eliza received credit she may or may not have deserved, and the credit changed something in how the camp looked at her. She did not, I guess, claim more than she was owed. When people spoke to her about it, she said she thought the woman had been getting better and had helped as best she could. This kind of understatement, she was learning, was understood and appreciated in this community in a way that felt similar to how it had been understood and appreciated in the communities she'd grown up in, which surprised her every time she noticed it. Tossabit heard about what she had done from Pawa, she suspected, though he did not mention it to her directly. What he did instead was a thing she had come to understand as his primary mode of communication. He changed slightly. The quality of his presence when he was near her shifted in a way she would have had trouble describing to someone who didn't know him, which at this point was almost everyone. He was less turned away. There was less, in my opinion, of that specific held quality, like a door not quite closed. One evening in early spring, he told her something that she thought about for a long time afterward. He said that, well, his wife had been afraid of nothing. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, as information, not as sentiment. But she had been around him long enough to know that when he offered information voluntarily without being asked, it was because the information was carrying something he didn't have the words for directly. She waited. Plus, he said that his wife hadn't understood the concept of a thing being too dangerous to attempt. He said, and here he paused in the way he paused when he was choosing between more than one way of saying something, that he hadn't fully appreciated this about her when she was alive, that he had sometimes found it exhausting, and that since her death it was the thing he thought about most. Eliza sat with this. She understood what he was telling her. Plus, he wasn't comparing her to his wife. He was telling her something about what loss had taught him about what mattered. She said after a moment that she thought most people did not appreciate things when they were happening, that this seemed to be a general condition of being alive rather than a specific failing, and that she thought the trick was to notice the appreciating when it was occurring instead of waiting until after. He looked at her and he said, yes. The spring honestly moved towards summer. The days lengthened, the work changed, different rhythms, different demands, the constant labor of a community that survived through collective effort and lost something real every time a member of it stopped contributing. She was contributing now in ways she could see mattered. She was still learning, still finding the edges of what she understood and what she didn't, but the territory of the understood was expanding steadily. There was a moment in late spring, she would remember it clearly for the rest of her life, the specific quality of the light, the smell of the new grass, the sound of the camp going about its business around her. When she sat outside the lodge in the afternoon sun with her sewing in her hands and Tossabit came and sat down beside her. Not across from her or at a distance, but beside her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and he said nothing, and she said nothing. And they sat like that for the better part of an hour while the camp's life went on around them. She was aware in that hour of the full weight of what she had come through and what she had arrived at. She was aware of Thomas, of her daughter, of Margaret Foy, all the other people who had died on that trail and whom she had been too busy surviving to mourn properly. She held them for that hour, held them consciously, deliberately, let the loss be its full size. She let herself feel the specific loneliness of being a person who had come from somewhere that no longer existed, who was now somewhere else, building something that would never be the same as what had been taken. She let herself feel that, and at the same time she felt the shoulder almost touching hers. She felt the warmth of it. She felt the, in my opinion, particular solidity of a person who had decided, against their own better judgment, and despite everything they had lost, to be present. She thought, this is also real. Both of those things were real. The loss and the shoulder, the grief and the warmth. She did not have to choose between them and had never been asked to. Nita appeared at the edge of the lodge, looked at the two of them and apparently decided that whatever was happening did not require her assistance, which was unusual enough that Eliza almost smiled. Almost. The summer would, bring its own difficulties. It always did. There would be questions about her status that weren't fully resolved, questions from outside the camp, from the wider world. That hadn't forgotten that a white woman was living in Comanche territory and had opinions about this that it intended to express. There would be the question of children she had mentioned, which was still a question and not yet an answer. There would be the work of continuing to build day by day, the thing she and Tossabit were building, which had no single name in either of their languages and which she was beginning to think was all the more valuable for that reason. But the summer actually wasn't here yet. Right now there was the afternoon light and the sewing in her hands. The man beside her who had buried his heart and chosen slowly and without announcing it to dig it back up. Right now there was this. She turned her attention back to her work. The stitch she was laying was close and even, the kind of stitching that held things together under pressure, the kind her mother had taught her was worth doing right, because it was the stitching that didn't show, that determined whether a thing lasted. The camp went on around her. The horses' look moved in the afternoon quiet. Somewhere a child was laughing at something. The grass smelled green and new. She put in the next stitch. And the actually next, and in the next. That was how it was done. That was honestly how everything was done. Not in the moments of decision or crisis or revelation, but in the ordinary accumulation of ordinary days, each one a stitch in something that would hold if you put it in carefully enough, if you were patient enough, if you kept your hands steady and your attention on the work and did not lose faith in the value of the making. She was still here. She was still making. That she had decided was more than enough to go on with.